Hello, welcome to COM 222 Intercultural Communications. And today we're going to start talking about the approaches on how we study international communication. So we're going to approach this topic from two different directions. Part 1 offers an overview of several selected historical eras in which intercultural communications played a primary role in social development on a grand scale. And Part 2 provides you with the appreciation of the philosophy underlying our concept of intercultural communication and describes the fundamental components of communication culture and intercultural communications. So before we get into the conversation of communication, we want to talk about what led to this need to study intercultural communication, and that's the rise of globalism. Globalization has created an environment where cross-cultural awareness and intercultural communication competence are daily necessities. Globalization came about as transportation and communication technologies have improved, making it easier to travel all over the world and interact. Countries around the world are interconnected and interdependent upon each other's economic and political interests. For example, in 2008, when the housing market crashed in the United States, because of our interdependence around the world, we actually brought down a bunch of other economies with us. So, the bigger you are in the world stage, the more impact you're going to have. So, for example, plague breaks out occasionally in Madagascar, and that's not going to impact us very much because they're not exactly known as a world power. Although a very cute cartoon. People in modern society are living at the same time within particular cultural settings on one hand, and between different cultural environments on the other, which results in all of us having this multiple identity concept. Culture and communication are influenced by societal change, and these changes need to be acknowledged in theoretical development and practical application. So every time there is a massive shift in the historical aspect. For example, for most of us in our lifetime, September 11th, 2001 will define that major shift. For our grandparents who lived through Pearl Harbor, or the parents who lived through John F. Kennedy being killed, assassinated. These are all things that change the way we communicate with each other. So globalization has been occurring since the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, so probably about 4,000 years ago. Peoples from other lands and diverse cultures have been interacting for trade and commerce for about 3,000 years. The advent of new technologies has simply accelerated the process. Intercultural communication as an academic discipline is relatively new, though, starting in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And it came about primarily after World War II because we wanted to help our allies better carry out their post-war reconstruction, because countries like France, Germany, and England were literally destroyed during World War II. And if you look at the picture on the bottom right, that's pretty much what London and the major cities in Germany look like. France did not suffer as much bombing because they gave up pretty quickly. No offense to the French, but they saved a lot of their historic buildings because of that. And if you're wondering if Italy had some problems, no, they were actually on the side of the Nazis, at least until the Americans showed up. The continued growth of international commerce due to transportation deregulation, which made air travel way less expensive in the 1970s and 1980s, created a need to understand how to effectively interact with and manage people from other cultures. In the 1990s, with the technological advances in communication, i.e. the internet, it made intercultural competence a necessity. In the 21st century, an appreciation of cultural differences is needed in order to succeed in almost any endeavor. So, we understand that the history of transportation going back from, the horse and buggy through the very beginnings of the automobile to the air travel that we have today, it's cheaper, it's faster, it's easier. All of those things come together to make it more accessible to be in other cultures and to work with other cultures. In the 1980s especially, the United States and Japan were working together significantly on various projects. And that became a big relationship that was cultivated through these in early 90s. And then China decided to get in on the capitalism thing. And they were a much bigger fish to go after. So the United States loves its China trade. So, intercultural communication occurs whenever a person from one culture sends a message to be processed by a person from a different culture. When people communicate, regardless of the situation or context, they are trying to persuade, inform, or entertain. In other words, when you communicate, you do so with a purpose, an objective. You're trying to make meaning. Communication is the management of messages with the objective of creating meaning. The only qualifiers we place on communications are intentionality and interaction. You can talk to yourself all day long, but that is not going to be the same kind of communication that we're discussing. We are talking about interacting with people from different cultures. 8 major structural communication components. And this is basically how communication process works. You have the sender, and this is the person or the group who originates the message. The message itself consists of information the sender desires to have understood, the data used to create meaning. Messages, which can be verbal or nonverbal, are encoded and transmitted via a channel to the receiver. The channel is any means that provides a path for moving a message from the sender to the receiver. Channels can include email, text message, verbal statements, picking up the phone and having a conversation. Then number 4, we have the receiver, and this is intended recipient of the message and the location where the meaning is created. The receiver interprets the message and assigns a meaning, which may or may not be what the sender intended. After interpreting the message and assigning a meaning, the receiver may prepare a response. This is any action taken by the receiver as a result of the meaning he or she assigns to the message. The important thing here is feedback, which helps us evaluate the effectiveness of a message. Depending on the feedback, we may rephrase or strengthen our message to provide greater clarity, ask whether the message was understood, or perhaps even retract the statement. The physical environment refers to the location where communication occurs, such as a classroom. The contextual or social environment is more abstract. We alter our communication style in response to the occasion and the receiver, the contextual environment. Finally, we have noise, which is the last component of the communication cycle, but it concerns the different type of interference or distractions that plague every communication event. So, in terms of a graphical representation, if you look at the bottom of this slide, you have your source, who is sending the message, and they basically encode the message. And what that means is they're selecting specific words, phrases, and spelling choices to encode the message. And then that channel, so for example, a text message is your channel, and The receiver then has to figure out what the sender intended. There's that intentionality. Oftentimes, when we're having a conversation with someone over text message and we're using all the abbreviations and emoticons, happy faces, we're not always clear. And that's why feedback is so incredibly important, because that feedback allows us to clarify the message. And that's what's important. So let's talk about culture. Ruth Benedict wrote, "What really binds men together is their culture, the ideas and the standards they have in common." Contemporary definitions of culture commonly mention shared values, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, norms, material objects, and symbolic resources. We learn the rules of our culture as we grow up, beginning at birth and continuing throughout our lifetime. As a result, our culture rules are ingrained in the subconscious, enabling us to react to familiar situations without thinking. It is when you enter another culture with different rules that differences are encountered. You're a little 2-year-old and you're learning how to feed yourself, and mommy gives you a little plastic fork with Mickey Mouse on it, or Elsa from Frozen, and you teach yourself how to eat using a fork. And now you are a young person, 18, 19, and you go out to dinner with some friends, and you go get Chinese food, and you've always eaten Chinese food with a fork, but they're all using chopsticks. This is on a very minimal level that differences in culture that we begin to encounter. If you were raised Catholic, the first time you step foot into a mosque or a temple might be a little weird for you. Doesn't mean it's bad, it's just different. Cultural rules provide a framework that gives meaning to events, objects, and people. Culture also provides us with our identity or sense of self. From childhood, we are taught the idea of belonging to a variety of groups: our family, our community, our church, sports teams, schools, and ethnicity. Our cultural identity is derived from our sense of belonging to a particular cultural or ethnic group. Growing up, we learn the rules of social conduct appropriate to our specific cultural group or groups. So if you look at this infographic kind of thing over here on the right, if you start in the very middle, this is who you are. Your mental ability, your physical ability, your age, your race, your ethnicity, your gender identity, and your gender, and your sexual orientation. The next layer are the people that have the most important influence in your life. So, your family, your life, your military experience, country knowledge, work style, education, income, personal habits, communication style, work experience, language, and your religion. So all of those have a much more significant impact on us than we even begin to realize. Then, as we move out in the circles or away from the bullseye, various other things begin to impact us, like our job, where we work, what our status is. All of these things create a culture for us. So we have multiple cultures in our lives. Can point to and say, well, in this world I am, a teacher, and I'm Irish, and I love the Eagles. So there you go. That's me in a nutshell. Culture's components. So, culture is learned through interactions, observations, and imitation. The proper ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving are communicated to us. Learning how to eat with a fork, a pair of chopsticks, or even one's fingers is a learned cultural behavior. And there are some places in the Middle East where they put a giant bowl of food down and everybody eats from the same giant bowl with their fingers. And of course, in the United States, we would find that very unhygienic. But in these cultures, it's seen as a way of growing closer, demonstrating trust and appreciation and loyalty. This learning, often referred to as inculturation, is both conscious and subconscious and has the objective of teaching the individual how to function properly within a specific cultural environment. Again, here's a very brief example. When you're hanging out with your friends, you probably talk about things in a much different way than when you're hanging out with your grandparents or your older parents. You're going to have different senses of what's appropriate in each situation. And that, in fact, is a sign of maturity, not a sign that you're selling out. Culture is transmitted intergenerationally. You learn your culture from family members, teachers, peers, books, personal observations, and a host of media sources. These were communicated to the members of your generation by these many sources. You are also a source for passing these cultural expectations to future generations, usually with little or no variation. So, in terms of who you are as a person, a lot of this comes not just from your parents, but your grandparents, your great-grandparents. If in your household doing charitable acts is very, very important, why? Where did that come from? Because some families, they don't believe in charity. So you go back into your ancestry and you find that there was somebody who was such a philanthropist or did so much good stuff, and this is where it got passed down to the next generation. Culture is symbolic. Words, gestures, and images are merely symbols used to convey meaning. So over here on the right-hand side, you'll see a lot of what we would call American symbols. We have the White House, we have a sheriff's badge, a football, a hot dog, we have a cowboy hat and the Statue of Liberty, a hamburger. And if you go overseas, everybody wants to know how many hamburgers you eat as an American. And then things like the state flag and the eagle. Culture is dynamic. Within a culture, new ideas, inventions, and exposure to other cultures create change. This is called diffusion or cultural borrowing. And this is a source of change. The internet has accelerated cultural diffusion by making new knowledge and insights easily accessible. Immigration is a major source of cultural diffusion. Most changes affecting culture are often exterior in nature, such as dress, food preference, modes of transportation or housing, values, ethics, morals, the importance of religion or attitudes towards gender, age, and sexual orientation, which constitute the deep structures of culture and are far more resistant to major change and tend to endure from generation to generation. So in terms of what we're looking at here with culture, we have to keep in mind that our cultural changes occur every day of our life. And it's not appropriation necessarily, but if you are the kind of person who never, ever, ever tried sushi, and then a friend convinces you to try sushi, and all of a sudden this becomes your new favorite food, it doesn't mean you've appropriated Japanese culture. It just means that you have changed how you view, food from this culture. Culture is ethnocentric. This strong sense of group identity or attachment produced by culture can also lead to ethnocentrism, which is the tendency to view one's own culture as superior to others. Ethnocentrism can also come from a lack of contact with other cultures or the economic presumption that one group should have the economic and political power, which is what happened in Nazi Germany and when Stalin took over the Soviet Union and starved 50 million people. Ethnocentrism examples, you have your white guy go say into the black guy, go back to Africa. Then the white guy tells Hispanic looking man, go back to Mexico. And then he's kind of stuck when he gets to the Native Americans because they're Native Americans. But, this tendency to think that our country is the best is very normal. If you are watching the Olympics, doesn't matter if you even know anything about the sport. If you're an American and an American wins a gold medal, you feel a little good for your country. On the other side of the coin, if you're living in Germany or England or China, Japan, and your representative from your country wins a gold medal, you're going to believe your country's the best too. Those kinds of things make you feel better about life. So we have different kinds of culture. So number one, we have high culture, which includes the achievement of a society in terms of the most esteemed forms of literature, art, and music. So we're not necessarily talking about Kanye's last album. Rather, we're looking at the literature like Hemingway, Steinbeck, Alice Walker. Those people that have said something about the American culture. Art, same thing. You can look at somebody like Andy Warhol and say he just painted soup cans. But what did it represent from the 70s? And with music, from an American perspective, you have some people like Prince and Madonna and the Beach Boys that have defined what American music is for a long time. In terms of culture as a behavior, the ways people agree to behave, act, and respond, this is also related to clothing, food, architecture, transportation, appearance, and so on. It is usually called overt culture, or in the iceberg model of culture. Ooh, and look, there's an iceberg on this page. What is above the waterline is easily seen. So the language, the food, the holidays, the festivals, how people dress. And if you go to another country, for example, if you go to Italy, it'll be obvious, the language. They're very proud of art. They have all 4 of the turtles represented in all the museums. And most importantly, the food in Italy is just amazing. So again, these are things that are easy to see. The third meaning of culture includes modes of perception, belief, and values which are not easily observable and is often out of our own and others' awareness. It is called covert culture, and in the iceberg model of culture, it is what is below the waterline. Covert culture leads to overt action. So, for example, if you believe that it is your duty to help others, then when you see someone hurt on the street, this sense of duty will spur you to run to their assistance. And not everybody's like that. Not everybody wants to be involved. So some of the ideas that we're talking about here, and you can look at the below the waterline, things like how you raise your children, how you perceive beauty. What are the general biases? What does body language mean? Competitiveness, notions of what is modest or not, how you develop and sense authority. So all of these things that are not quite obvious, but are under the surface just waiting to be found. So let's look at perception, which is the procedure of selecting, organizing, and evaluating stimuli. The volume of environmental stimuli is far too large for us to pay attention to everything. So we select only what is considered relevant or interesting. People conduct their lives in accordance with how they perceive the world, and those perceptions are strongly influenced by culture. People from dissimilar cultures frequently perceive the world differently. Beliefs can be defined as individually held subjective ideas about the nature of an object or event. So, for example, strict adherents of Judaism and Islam believe eating pork is forbidden, but in China, pork is a staple. So again, it's all about these different subjective beliefs. Our beliefs and values push us to hold certain attitudes, which are learned tendencies to act or respond in a specific way to events, objects, people, or orientations. Our worldview is what forms an individual's orientation towards such philosophical concepts as God, the universe, nature, etc. As an example, many Asian and Native North American cultures hold a worldview that people should have a harmonious, symbiotic relationship with nature. In contrast, Euro-Americans are instilled with the concept that people must conquer and mold nature to conform to personal needs and desires. So, working around nature versus creating what you want nature to look like. Culture influences cognitive thinking patterns, which include reasoning and approaches to problem solving. Culture often produces different ways of knowing and doing. Westerners use a linear cause and effect thinking process, which places considerable value on logical reasoning and rationality. Northeast Asians, i.e., the Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans, employ a more holistic thinking pattern. They see problems as much more complex and interrelated, requiring a greater understanding of and emphasis on the collective rather than focusing separately on individual parts. What is common in one culture may be problematic in another. From the Japanese holistic perspective, however, new topics can have an influence on previously discussed points. So let's talk about some nonverbal behaviors. These include gestures, including the South Philly salute, as we call it in the Philadelphia region. Facial expressions, so you can usually tell if somebody's angry or really happy or really sad. Eye contact and gaze. And eye contact is something that's very cultural. In the United States, we believe that if you can make eye contact to someone, you're not lying and that you're an honest, trustworthy person. In other cultures, eye contact is seen as rude and intrusive. The gaze, G-A-Z-E, is a concept that has been studied now for about 40 years, and it's about how we look at others. The gaze has power behind it. So if someone's trying to stare you down, or if someone is staring at a certain body part, they are moving into your nonverbal body space in a sense. And there's a lot of research on that, which is kind of outside the realm of this discussion, but it's a very interesting concept. Posture and movement, somebody who's standing straight up and down and, shoulders back, head up, obviously somebody who is feeling confident, whereas somebody with a slouched posture, we can kind of see they may be sad. How we touch people, how we dress, our ability to deal with silence. This is something that, again, very American to fill all the silences. On the other hand, you go somewhere in Asia, and silence is something that is much more accepted. The use of space and time, objects, and artifacts. In the United States, if you're 5 minutes before an appointment, you're on time. If you show up at the time of the appointment, they consider you late. Whereas if you go down to South America or some of the Mediterranean countries like Italy or Greece, 3 o'clock means anywhere from 3 to 4, usually 4, in certain parts of Africa. And, again, this is not a stereotype as much as a cultural phenomenon. Time is not that important. So when they say 2 o'clock, 2 o'clock doesn't mean 2 o'clock. It just means in that time range. It's a cultural concept. And then paralanguage, the pitch, the volume, intonation, how fast we talk, and gestures. We live on the East Coast in the Philadelphia region, and we tend to talk very quickly.
we go down the south, so Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and they have a hard time understanding us because we talk so quickly. They, on the other hand, talk very slowly and they draw out their vowels. So we are as irritated with them as they are with us. These nonverbal activities are intertwined with verbal behaviors and often carry as much or more meaning than the actual words spoken. Research has shown over and over again, we remember the underlying tone of the message much more than the message itself. Eye contact, and again we have talked about how for U.S. Americans direct eye contact is considered a necessary part of making a good impression. However, in some cultures, direct eye contact is considered rude or even threatening. Nonverbal facial and body expressions like language form a coding system for constructing and expressing meaning, and these expressions are culturally bound. Now, in terms of eye contact in a conversation, the business gaze, you tend to look either at their forehead or their eyes. A social gaze is you're gazing or looking at them, their eyes, their nose, their mouth. In an intimate gaze, and this is one where we are thinking of romantic things, to put it lightly, the gaze goes from up at the eyes down as far as we want it to go down and then back up again. So the idea here is the intimate gaze takes that long look down your entire body. Context is also an important consideration in intercultural communication interactions, where the rules for specific situations usually vary. What is expected in one culture is not necessarily correct in another. Unless both parties in the exchange are sensitive to how culture affects the contextual aspects of communication, difficulties will certainly arise and may negate effective interaction. The world population, as well as the U.S. domestic demographics, continues to move toward a pluralistic, multicultural society at a quick-step pace. So what does that mean? That means that you are seeing different cultures intermarrying and having children, different cultures working together, different cultures interacting in various settings. For example, I know a lot of guys and girls who play video games online, and they interact with people from all over the world. And again, this is something that was not possible more than 20 years ago. The resulting cultural mixing requires that everyone, both individually and as a society, become more tolerant of the varied beliefs, worldviews, values, and behaviors of people from other cultures. And the word tolerate or tolerant seems almost inadequate here. We have to do more than tolerate. We have to understand. We have to accept. If there is a cultural aspect to, child marriage, yeah, we can say no, that's not appropriate. Genital mutilation, very big in certain parts of North Africa, again, we can say, nope, not going to happen, not allowed. But if somebody prefers not to eat pork, we should be cool with that. There's a concept known as code switching. And this is the process of shifting from one style of speaking, a language or dialect, to another, depending on the social context or conversational settings. It is often used by members of minority ethnic groups to shape and maintain a sense of identity and a sense of belonging to a larger community. So over here on the right hand side is a cartoon, and it has a young girl saying, "Hey Miguel," and he responds, "Hey Susan, how are you?" She says, "I'm good, and you?" And he replies in Spanish, soy bueno, want to go to class. So he's throwing these words in there in a sense to build a community feeling with this young person. And this code switching occurs often in minority communities. In the same way that, for example, when you are out with friends and you meet somebody new and you see that everybody responds to them in very specific way, you're going to switch your behavior to match theirs, to mirror theirs. So we switch in our own way, and as well as in language. Globalization, however, has changed the notion of culture. Culture can no longer be described as the property of a single nation. Globalization has created the overlapping of global and local factors. Human beings are living at the same time within particular settings on the one hand and between cultural environments on the other. One lives between one's home and a family on one side, and also situated in the daily life world of going to school or working. This has been happening for thousands of years. In a culturally globalized world, between situations are becoming essential for any understanding of culture. So, where you share your cultural aspects, in that between, that Venn diagram, that piece in the middle, work culture. Cultures are not predestined to have some absolute distinctive characteristics. Cultures influence each other, and often there is a process of fusion. The problem becomes how we can identify at any given moment distinctive features to a culture which is in perpetual development and change. Think about the vast number of countries in the world which are multicultural and multilingual, and where there is a considerable amount of immigration. Nations are not culturally consistent within the same nation. Social classes, age, gender, education, religious affiliation, and several other factors contribute to the self-awareness and the self-consciousness which became the markers of cultural identity. In other words, they become subcultures within a national culture, and the members of these groups also have many things in common. So here are some of the more popular subcultures for young people. We have our emo, steampunk goth, cyber goth, hippie, Rastaman, metalhead, punk, hipster, biker, skinhead, and rapper. And oftentimes when you're young, you're looking for your identity. So this helps you find your identity. Cultures are not static phenomenon. They change constantly and are indefinitely renewable. How do we label a culture as unique and coherent when it is in constant development, especially when different cultures influence each other, occasionally fusing? We call this cultural fusion. Therefore, it's not a matter of one culture assimilating features of another. Rather, it is when newcomers acculturate to the dominant culture and maintain aspects of their minority culture. At the same time, the dominant culture also fuses aspects off the newcomer's culture. It has to be strongly emphasized that globalization is not a factor of homogenation, but of diversity. So the more globalized we become as a culture, the more diverse we become as a culture. Because as different cultures emigrate to the United States, we gain from these diverse perspectives. So for example, if you think about the fact that certain types of music have come from very specific cultures that have been accepted and embraced by American culture. Think of rap music, think of reggae music, think of jazz music. Think of the music that is specific to very specific cultures and how it has been brought into the mainstream. And this concept of mainstream means that it's become part of our culture. In his recent book, The New Japan by Matsumoto, he makes the statement that there is no support for the claim that Japanese are less individualistic and more collectivistic than Americans. He makes this distinction of two groups in Japan, the young generation being more individualistic and the older generation still being attached to the importance of the group. And that was always this idea in Japan and many other Asian countries, is that it is better to benefit the whole than the individual. So society, the benefit of society was more important. what Matsumoto is saying is that today the younger generation that has grown up with the internet, with this multicultural perspective, with this diversity, have become more individualistic and have moved away from this traditional collectivistic perspective. He proposes the concept of individual collectivism, that is, a society which can celebrate cultural diversity in thought and action, that is, individualism, while maintaining core values related to the importance of the group and hierarchy, which is collectivism. Cultural identities come from somewhere. They have histories. But like everything else, which is historical, they undergo constant transformation. Identity is never a priori, not a finished product. A priori is a Latin term that means knowledge you already have. Identity is no longer conceptualized as a given, but rather as something which is constantly negotiated and struggled over. Belonging to a number of groups means that the individual will have several identities or multiple identities. Human beings are living at the same time within particular cultural settings on the one hand, and between different cultural environments on the other. Even in the United States, we're all Americans. We all prize our freedom and independence. But you take somebody who supports Donald Trump, and then you take somebody who opposes Donald Trump, and their differences are significant. And you almost can't believe that these are both from the same quote-unquote culture. Bayard argues that identities are fluid, never homogeneous, and sometimes invented. Fixed cultural identities, in fact, don't exist. We've made stereotypes, we've given generalizations to these things, but they're constantly dynamic. They're moving, they're changing, they're evolving. Every year you get older, and every year you see the world from a different set of eyes, because the world treats you differently as you get older. So the first step for intercultural understanding is to have a clear idea about one's own culture and about our personal perceptions of this culture. This is not an easy task because perceptions about one's culture are mostly unconscious. There are two important facts concerning perception of one's culture. 1. Nations are not culturally homogeneous. Individuals in a nation may have very different perceptions about their culture. These perceptions will vary according to social class, age, education, gender, experiences in life, and many other factors. And 2, cultures are not static. They change constantly. These two factors are true for all cultures. So, people are diverse, and culture is constantly changing. And from there, we're going to look at the actual way we can better communicate on an intercultural level. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, please email or text your instructor. If you do not attend our college but are still interested and have a question, please leave a comment and we will respond as soon as we can. Have a wonderful day, and thank you very much.